Hi, everyone. Pastor Galen, lead pastor at Cheyenne Hills Church. Thank you so much for joining us on this podcast. We hope that these podcasts will be a real encouragement to you on your spiritual journey. You can also connect with Cheyenne Hills at CheyenneHills.org. Hope you enjoy the program.
We are across the street and around the world, Cheyenne Hills.
Well, hello, everybody, and welcome back to the podcast, and welcome back, Nathan. Glad to have you here. Good to have you here, man. So on Tuesdays and Thursdays, we've been reading through Genesis. Now, this week, we are in, I think, Genesis 15, talking about the promise of God, the covenant with Abram.
Right.
And how God signed that covenant.
Right.
Basically, Abram was asleep.
That's right.
And then God passes through these sacrifices, basically saying there's a covenant. And I was using that to say, talking about why I support Israel. And we were talking a little bit about Israel. So I'd like to get back to that. I'd like to hear your thoughts on, because right now,
Especially
Hamas and they're firing, I think over 4,000 rockets have been fired into Israel from Gaza Strip, from Hamas. And I know there's been some strikes. And I know there's a lot of political, so it's a right now thing. I'd like to talk about that a little bit. But before we get to that, there was I don't know how long ago it was, about a week and a half now, talking about a survey. You came in and you had, brought that to my attention, certainly. And I brought it, I don't know if you knew that, but I brought that to the church's attention. I just felt like,
I saw that.
After I talked with the lady that was on the school board, and she said, we couldn't see it either. I just thought, well, I think it would help her if we could, she wanted to see it and couldn't.
That's astonishing. Could you say that again? Even the school board didn't have access.
Did you not know
that? Well, you and I had talked about that, but that's something that I think has missed in the conversation. Even the school board has
and wanted to. And she said, she told me, she was just wonderful. I wish I could say her name. I just didn't get permission to. But she said, she said, Galen, we couldn't even see it. And she goes, I'm going to make some phone calls. So it's kind of interesting to me to see. And then thankfully, whoever's in power said, let's don't do this at this time. And they listened to the people and just saying, hey, we want to see this before you give it to the kids. That's the only thing we were asking for. And they listened. And I don't know about you, but I was a little astonished, but thankful that
thankful.
That they listened, and you said that there was actually several different, certainly the person on the school board asking some questions, I'm sure made a difference, but you said that there were several that actually went to your website, just as we instructed.
A number of them.
Is that right?
Yeah, a couple hundred of them at least.
Is that right? Wow.
I lost track of the numbers after a little while because it was climbing pretty fast, but I'm thankful. See, and this is exactly how a community ought to operate.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, the reason why Christians get involved is because we care. Yeah. And we love. There are things that we see that are dangerous, and we're trying to help people see what those issues are. And so it really is a number of Christians from all across the city of Cheyenne and participating because they've heard what the issue is. Yeah. And the church was acting like the church. Yeah. And that's a blessing.
Well, and I think this is my vantage point, because I see it as we were just sharing our voice, and it was heard, and I appreciate that. And I think a lot of times they don't hear our voice. I think a lot of times, my takeaway from what my conversation was with that school board member is, she has to represent everybody. Everybody's a taxpayer in Laramie County. She listens to all. But I think they hear a lot from other venues and not necessarily from the church. Yeah. And I don't know, for whatever reason, this one seemed like something that we could actually add some horsepower to a school board member that probably could use some support. And we just said, hey, we like for you to consider showing us this before you, or just do a withdrawal altogether, which it sounds like they did, at least for now.
Postponed anyway.
Postponed. Okay.
I think one thing that you just highlighted was the fact that with that kind of participation, one voice shouting in a crowd really doesn't get heard.
Right.
But when you
it sounds radical or something.
Right. Yeah. Well, a lot of times they don't even get heard over all of the other noise of a crowd.
Right.
But if you can get a whole section or two talking, pretty soon everyone else can hear it.
Yeah.
And sometimes being in elective office, there are so many people calling for your attention.
Yep. That's
to really begin to move, it takes all of us working together, and that's been the hope. And I think that really worked, and I'm really thankful.
Well,
for it.
I'll tell you, it was a learning experience for me. If there's pushback from our church for, honestly stepping out from behind the pulpit, if you will, and I didn't, just to say, guys, we need to be involved in this because for our kids' sake, I think it's important, and people stepped up and did participate.
Yeah.
And it makes me wonder: are there other things that we can do that fit? And I know you're the one that has the finger on the pulse of that, but I've even thought about some of the curriculum questions. There's been a lot of curriculum questions that have come to me, about some concerns, and it's like I really haven't weighed in on that. Do you have any thoughts? I know it's a big deal across our land.
Well, this is a challenge. So I've had the opportunity to participate with a group on behalf of Family Policy Alliance that deals with other groups from across the nation that have been working together talking about the 1776 Project.
Okay.
And we had a wonderful young lady from Texas that participated a couple of months ago. And one of the things that she ran into in Texas public school books, and Texas is considered one of the two major school book researching states.
Oh, wow.
And so whatever direction Texas takes is what it is.
Their country?
Right.
Is that right?
For more of the conservative groups, and then California will set the standard a lot of times for the more liberal side.
Okay.
So Texas matters.
Yeah.
And so in this particular circumstance, there's a horrific fella, I'm saying that pretty strong, but a man by the name of Howard Zinn lied very strongly about Christopher Columbus. Oh. And those lies are very clearly established. Well, he did that throughout American history to try to paint a radical view of American history.
Okay.
And Howard Zinn had key words and phrases in his book. Now, the thing is, Howard Zinn is not mentioned in the public school civics textbooks at all. But if you do a search for, and this is what this young lady had done, she had done a lot of research on this. If you look for key words and phrases that are unique to Zinn's writing and to his book, pretty soon they started showing up as she began to look through those public school textbooks.
Okay.
Most people don't walk around talking about critical race theory. They never will say that outright. They don't talk about Marxism and communism outright. The ideas that are coming through can still be there.
Right, exactly.
The challenge is trying to chase those down. And so I just before we got here together, I had a call from another community in this state trying to figure that out from a civics. This is in a small community, considered a fairly conservative community. Yesterday, I dealt extensively with a lady that was very concerned because in her school library, they have a librarian that's bringing in really radical stuff to introduce to young kids. And so this is becoming more and more prevalent, and we have to be more focused. And so your initial question was, how can we get more involved?
Yeah. Or should we? And what's this look like?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think step number one is to understand the importance of what we're talking about.
Right.
A lot of times when it comes to education, people are more concerned about whether the school bus shows up in front of their house on time, as opposed to what their child is learning the other 6 hours a day that they're there.
Right.
And so we have to get our focus right. And this is where school boards matter in a very important way. And so a lot of times people view the president on top, and then the Senate, and then the House of Representatives, and then your state governor and your state offices and state legislature and all those things. But really, we have to reverse that view of government and understand that really what matters is what's closest to you first.
Well, like school boards.
Like school boards.
Yeah, no kidding.
Town councils, county commissions.
Sure, right.
And so if we focus on the grassroots wisely as Christians, what's happening in our own backyard, it's kind of like building Nehemiah's wall. Everyone focused on their own backyard, and at the end of the day, they had a whole wall built.
Yeah,
and
that's good.
That's what we have to do.
Well, I like that, and I know you're going to keep me involved in that and informed, because
I'm so thankful, by the way, Galen, for your church.
Well, yeah, me too. And I was very thankful for them. I mean, if there was any negative, I didn't hear it. And we have a lot of teachers at Cheyenne Hills Church. We have a lot of administrators. We have a lot, and I was very careful not to be, offend anybody, but just to say, listen, we need to, and I think the things that we can, in a positive way, just shed some light on.
Absolutely.
I think that's at least for me. Yeah. And so I appreciate, and this is a perfect venue for it. Mm-hmm. We can, if there's curriculum issues or questions, I mean, for us to unpack it here, I think it's a perfect venue. And I think the church is starting to tune in a little bit more all the time. And so that's just, I really appreciate that. So just real quick though, Zen, what year was he writing? When did he do?
So I think he passed away, like within the last 20 years.
Oh, so he was pretty recent.
Of course, as an elderly man, but really where his work began to take off was in the 70s and on upwards through the 90s. And I don't have that timeline exactly squared away, but I know that it's fairly recent.
No, when we were in seminary, we studied Christopher Columbus, and from my perspective, he was rock solid. I mean, a man of faith. He was. Actually, there's a story, and maybe you could clear this up, but it's kind of rattling around in the back of my mind. But it was in Spain when they expunged a whole bunch of Jewish people from their...
The Inquisition.
Spanish Inquisition. Mm-hmm. And he was a part of helping relocate some of those Jewish people to America. Is that true, or is that...
I don't know.
I don't know where I got that from.
I've heard that he was very active in trying to help those people. I don't know the long term of it. Yeah. I do know that he was attempting to help many Indians. So what he found when he got to the New World is he found that there were some very sweet Indians. They literally were so kind, very pacifistic, not warlike at all, but they were easy prey for other indigenous tribes, and that would come out and enslave a bunch of them. It was just horrible. Oh, wow. He literally was standing up for Indians. The challenge that we face, what Howard Zinn does, is he marches through the diary of a guy that was part of that. The problem is, as he marches through that guy's diary, where it talks about war and enslavement and everything else, you'll notice that there are large ellipses in Zinn's work, because as he's quoting that very diary, he literally will jump from one paragraph to the next and make it where if the guy says it was up, it's down. If it was black, it was white.
So he really reformed it to make it sound like his narrative.
He cut and paste to make his own narrative.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. No, that's terrible.
Sadly, that sort of stuff can be taught in public schools, and that's why we have to be very involved, not only with what time the bus shows up, but with what our child is being taught.
Yeah. Well, that's almost I can make a transition here.
Okay.
This is my pastoral. I can make this huge transition, but this whole idea of propaganda.
Yes.
And false narratives, and I've you talk about the war between Israel and Palestine, and I will tell you that over the years, that if you depend, you gotta listen, be careful who you listen to, because there's the story and then there's the real story.
Right.
And the amount of propaganda that comes out that says, well, they hit us first, and it's like, well, this one, I don't know how they're going to propagandize this, because there was a lot of bombs.
I know.
Sent out of Gaza. Yeah, I mean, you could see those. Wasn't that quite a picture?
It's amazing.
They had all those bombs coming out, and then the Iron Dome coming up and intercepting all those. And what a phenomenal picture! It's like a classic that'll go. I'll remember that forever. You just remember that picture. But what do you see when you've seen the Israel Hamas anything? What's your comments?
Well, I tell you what, I am so thankful that when we talk about the actual right side of history, is being on the right side of his story.
Yeah, for sure.
And that also gets lost in this conversation, because
that's true.
When we look at how God has blessed Israel, God has given them the opportunity, this tiny little nation surrounded on all sides by enemies.
Right.
And God's given them the ability to protect themselves.
Right.
And so what we watch is Hamas in Gaza that being flooded with all sorts of arms and munitions from Iran. Now, let's step back. This is a theological issue. Iran is doing everything they can to sow strife so that they can usher in the Mahdi, their version of a Messiah figure.
That's right.
And so their whole intention is to destabilize the Middle East.
Right.
in Hamas, a group that actually it very much oppresses the people of Gaza. I understand their popularity there is not high at all, but they're powerful enough in that war-torn region to where there's not much you can do about it in Gaza. So they fired off 3,000 initially. I think it's up to closer to 4,000 now. Right. And they did a whole bunch of them trying to strike down, trying to just overwhelm the Iron Dome defense system. By the way, those Iron Dome missiles are around $40,000 a pop.
Wow.
And you consider how many of them have had to be fired off just to protect. Yeah. These are people that are paying. Wow. You know, when we talk about our own GDP, when we talk about our economy, for them, their economy literally has to be involved in making sure that missiles don't land on elementary schools.
Yeah, for sure. And I had no idea that they cost that much. So that's a pretty wealthy nation, but that's a huge inventory.
Right.
I don't know what kind of inventory. They say that Hamas has like 20,000. That's what I've heard. I've heard the number 20,000 rockets, missiles, whatever you want to call them, embedded in Gaza. And so you would think you would have to have at least that many deterrent or the Iron Dome, which is terribly expensive. I can't imagine.
Well, part of this is trying to help people step back for just a second and think about the fact that there is this oppressed narrative that the left uses in a lot of different ways. And in this particular situation, they're the ones firing off thousands of missiles, and Israel chooses to defend themselves, and actually does it in a way where they're trying mightily to not have any sort of damage to civilians. Now that happens because Hamas literally will use civilians as civilian shields, human shields. And Israel's trying very hard. They'll drop leaflets. They've even developed some sort of concussion bomb that will not destroy anything, but make a huge noise to tell people, evacuate this building now.
Yeah, they call it knocking on the door.
Isn't that great?
They're knocking on the roof.
Yeah.
And they send that big boom, and that's basically saying, guys, get out of this place because it's coming down. And then I don't know how much longer.
What other nation announces?
Nobody does that.
Yeah, announce to your enemy that, hey, I'm about to come right now.
I'm going to knock this building down because there's Hamas in there.
And yet in this oppressor-oppressed narrative that the far left will push, Israel is always the aggressor.
Yeah.
And this is that same thing that we watch in our own community. Sometimes people will find out that there is a junior high school where I found out just this last week. There were 2 children in March of 2019 that literally were blocking the stairway into that school building, waving very large transgender flags. And so shortly afterward, within a couple of weeks, there's a kid that puts posters on the wall that were absolutely wrong. But you look at the narrative, no one's ever really pointed, well, what precipitated this whole thing? There were people trying to drive a narrative and create struggle.
That's true.
The same thing's happening over in Gaza.
Well, it is, and it's really happening. It's the way I can't think of that guy's name, and I'll think of it in a second. But it's create chaos. So you get something, make
Saul Alinsky.
Thank you.
Yes.
That's their whole thing, is to try to create a narrative of chaos and division, and then oppressor, which is Marxist.
Yeah.
And it's the playbook. But it's like you would think people would go, I get this now, but I don't know. People are just blind to it. However, there are interesting countries across Europe that I thought it was really interesting. I think the Czech Republic is one of them. They're standing with Israel. I think the Germans flew a Israeli flag.
Wow.
Yeah. No.
Germany.
There was people that are saying, that's governments basically saying we stand with Israel. There's others that are, wanting to, diss Israel and all that. It's an interesting dynamic that I don't fully understand, but I will tell you. And so what we studied in Genesis chapter 15 is God said, I will give you this land. And we see this narrative unfold in, 1948, when in the 40s, after the World War II, the British said, hey, we're tired of this land. We'll give it to the Israelis, and Hoover signed off on it. The United States government, everybody seemed to agree with it. They got the land. Then they declared it was their land. And just this whole idea that it wasn't. I think it was part of a promise, but it also has some real strong signing off from the UN and all these things. So for the Palestinians, they've always said that the Jews, they've always wanted them out, always.
Right.
And the Jews, so Netanyahu said this, and I heard this several times when we were in Israel. If the Palestinians will lay down their weapons, if the Palestinians lay down their weapons, there would be peace. If the Israelis lay down their weapons, there would be no more Israel. Right?
That's right.
And so there's this whole idea and Netanyahu has made that very clear. So I don't know. This whole struggle is just it's sad. It's overwhelming. There's a part of it too, and you don't have to comment on this because this is just me. But I'm really frustrated with our government because it used to be that would be Republican, Democrat, didn't matter. There was a unilateral support of Israel.
That's right.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
I mean, there may be a few defectors. Yeah. It's like now there's a whole bunch in the Democratic side that they are separating themselves, and I'm not even. It sounds to me like President Biden was saying to Netanyahu to stand down. And he's basically saying, we can't.
Yeah, right.
We'll get annihilated if
someone's in a knife fight. You can't tell them stand down while the other guy has a knife and is trying to kill him. Yeah. That's calling for their death. Yeah. And one of the things that really is problematic and challenging here, it used to be the stance within the Democratic Party. Harry S. Truman is the one whose efforts led in the United Nations.
There you go, Truman. Thank you.
Right, Truman.
Yeah.
To in 1948. To the founding of the Israeli state. Right. And when you look at that, even beforehand, that place was it was a barren wasteland. And the Grand Mufti of I think it was Jerusalem. I forget his name now. It's been a little while since I read about it. It's been several years, but I do recall that he was the one in the 1920s. Well, that began to call for the expulsion of anyone of Jewish extraction, people who had been there for years, decades. It began to call for their death. Oh. Later on, he's the one that signed up with the Nazi Party. And even to this day, many times you'll read statements like from Hamas that if you were to read that in the 1940s, you would think that came from Germany. That came from a very specific political party. And now those people are the ones that some who used to recognize that as evil are now calling it good. Yeah. And so that is very problematic. Yeah. But
no, it's a sad day to me because if you go biblically, Romans 9, 10, and 11, it's very, very clear. Yes. If the demise of the Jews meant blessings for the Gentiles or salvation for the Gentiles, that's us. Yeah. What would its fulfillment be? And that's why we pray for Jerusalem or Israel. They're chosen people. And it's not so much they're chosen. It's not means they're righteous. It doesn't mean they're perfect. They're secular, and I get all that. And I'm not saying they're a righteous people, but they have a covenant, and God signed the covenant in His own hand, so to speak, while Abraham was asleep. And God said, I'm going to fulfill this. It's an unconditional covenant. So His name is at stake here. And it's like, don't get in the way of that one. I mean, that's, to me, theologically, there's no question. We need to support Israel. But I think here's the redeeming part for me on this whole thing is that, as we see today, God, I think I see God's hand in Israel. That Iron Dome, and that you can say what you want, they deter those, but there's some missiles that have hit clear out into the water that miss totally, and even some Palestinians are saying their God is moving these missiles. I don't know. There's a whole news page about that. I thought that was fascinating. Yeah. But to think that God's hand is on them and has never left them over these 4,000 years. That's when the covenant was made with Abraham. That's right. And then think about that new covenant that was made at the cross at Calvary. Amen. And I love the picture of the fact that even if I'm faithless, He remains faithful, right? And God's got, Christ has got this. He paid for my sin, no matter, yes, I've sinned. We all sin. We all fall short of the glory of God, but he has paid and his name is on us. I think it's a powerful picture, and we're seeing God's faithfulness with Israel. But that means there's a faithfulness with us as well. It's a very comforting thing to see in the midst of a very difficult situation.
Yeah. God has not rejected his people whom he foreknew.
Amen.
Romans 11:2.
Yeah.
And when we look at that God never gives up on us.
Yeah.
His love is overwhelming. That should actually bring strength to us in any struggle we face too.
That's the one thing the one good that's coming out of this is I'm seeing God's faithfulness.
Amen.
Amen. Well, thanks for joining us. I hope this, enlightened you some, maybe challenged you some. Thank you all for your participation, honestly, in some things that right here locally that matter. So God bless you. Thanks for joining us.